Okay, I think most of the people who signed up are here, so let's just start, and if people are late, you can still join in later. So welcome to this virtual NeuroEpigenetics workshop. Today we are very happy to be joined by Rosen and Judith Suissa to discuss their paper, Children, Parents and Non-Parents, to Whom Does the Future Belong? My name is Emma Moorman and I will facilitate today's workshop. And I'm a PhD student at the NeuroEpigenetics project, about which I will say a few words in a few moments. But first we can take a look at today's program. After my short introduction, Rachel and Judith will introduce us to some of the ideas in their paper. And then we have a very diverse lineup of respondents. So each response will be fairly short, around 5 minutes. And then there's room after each response for a conversation between the respondents, the authors, and the audience members. Some practical remarks. I think I can be brief because, as we already said before the meeting started, we're all Zoom experts by now. Please keep your microphone off when you're not speaking. You can choose whether or not you want to switch your camera on or off. It may be nice for others to see who is asking a question if you're doing so, but there's no obligation. Also, we will record this lecture and upload it on our YouTube channel. So if you don't wanna be in that, please keep your camera off. If you have a question for one of the speakers, please signal this by posting a message in the chat. So you can either write down the full question or just a subject, or write that you want to have a follow-up, for example. I will keep an eye on that, and I will also keep an eye on my email in case people are experiencing technical difficulties. So before we start, a word on neuroepigenetics, which is the project many of the people present here today are involved in. And it's an interdisciplinary ERC-funded research project led by its PI, Christine Hens, who is also here today. And this project investigates how persons with various neurodevelopmental conditions, such as autistic persons, persons with Tourette syndrome or ADHD, and their families and the general public experience the interaction between their condition and their biological and social environment. And we are particularly interested in the concept of moral responsibility in this context. And since research in epigenetics is increasingly providing us with insight into the mechanisms through which our physical and social environment affect us even on a molecular level, we believe that thinking through the normative implications of such findings is really important. So who's responsible for our health and that of future generations? And what does health actually mean in this context? Well, we believe in an interdisciplinary approach to tackle these questions. Researchers in our projects use different empirical approaches alongside more traditional philosophical ones. So this can be experimental philosophy, interviews, and other types of qualitative research. But I think what we all have in common is that we want to value experience stories as much as possible. Our team members have backgrounds in diverse disciplines such as philosophy, child psychiatry, literary studies, disability studies, pharmacology, and genetics. And subdisciplines and theoretical approaches include analytic philosophy, philosophy of biology, new materialism, bioethics, disability studies, and many, many more. So this summer we started with a series of virtual interdisciplinary lectures. We aim to host one lecture every month by a variety of researchers who are working on issues that relate to our sub-projects. So our first guest was Eva Jablonka, a theoretical biologist and geneticist, who spoke about her paper, Cultural Epigenetics. And then in September, my colleague Jo Bervoets teamed up with the Autism Ethics Network for an afternoon on philosophical perspectives on neurodiversity. And all of these previous workshops along with some other videos of us can be watched on our YouTube channel. So with today's workshop, we aim to introduce to our project a perspective from philosophy of education and also childhood studies. There are already quite some connections to be made. In 2017, Christine Hens published an edited volume on parental responsibility in the context of neuroscience and genetics. And for various of our team members, our commitment to experience stories and participatory research means that they are interviewing, working with, and learning from children and adolescents. And this paper inspired us also, I think, as it views children as being part of the collective efforts to imagine and strive towards alternative and more just futures. But before I say too much about the paper, I will now introduce its authors to you and give the floor to them. So Rachel Rosen works at UCL, University College London, as Associate Professor of Sociology of Childhood. And her work is located at the intersections of sociology of childhood and materialist feminist thought, with a focus on social reproduction, migration, and the impact of intersecting inequalities on children's everyday lives. And one of her recent research projects focuses on the care of children by children on migration journeys and how these caring practices are taken into account in children's efforts to settle and claim asylum in the UK. So for instance, she did research in refugee camps in Calais on how refugee children care for each other, a kind of care that she argues is often overlooked. And Rachel's recent blog posts and publications include Pardon Us for Caring, Childhood and the Neoliberal Project, and Women and Children Together and Apart, Finding the Time for Social Reproduction Theory. And Judith Suissa is a professor of philosophy of education at UCL. She did much work on anarchism and education, which resulted in a book on the subject. And she also co-authored The Claims of Parenting with Stefan Ramaekers, who is also one of today's respondents. And in this book, they demonstrate the irreducible philosophical richness of the parent-child relationship and provide an important counterbalance to the overtly empirical and largely psychological focus of a great deal of parenting literature. And in her research, Judith is particularly concerned to explore the underlying political and moral assumptions of pedagogical relationships outside the arena of institutional forms of education. So Rachel and Judith, thanks a lot for being here today and wanting to share your thoughts with us. And the floor is yours.
Thanks. Let me just get this screen sharing happening. Can you see that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for having us here today. We're really looking forward to the discussion and for the warm welcome. The focus of our presentation today is going to be on the paper that Emma mentioned, Children, Parents, and Non-Parents, To Whom Does the Future Belong? We're going to run through the paper and some of our core arguments and follow that up with some questions that we're left with. But before we do that, we'd like to first start with our entry points into the paper. There we go. So my own point was both personal and sociological. My partner came home one day and she said to me, I've just had the oddest conversation. I was having a discussion with some people about something to do with environmentalism, and they stopped me in my tracks and told I wasn't allowed to comment. They said to me, you can't comment on the future, you don't have children. And everybody in this group nodded in agreement and basically refused to listen to her comments on sort of environmental climate change and the things we should be doing in order to avert disaster. So we were both taken aback by this, and it wasn't entirely unfamiliar, but it had never been said so blatantly before that we didn't have the right to speak about the future because we didn't have children. So it was quite explicitly stated. About the same time, so this is 2016, in the UK Conservative Party leadership contest, a similar set of issues emerged. Andrea Leadsom asserted her supremacy as a candidate over Theresa May on the basis of her motherhood. She claimed that this gave her a stake in the future that the childless May did not possess. So these kind of two different experiences made me start thinking about the question, to whom does the future belong? And who has rights to claim future? What does it mean to make such claims to the future? These sort of more empirical contexts link to some of the conceptual questions that my work explores within the field of childhood studies. So I think childhood studies has made a very convincing case that children are not simply not yets, adults in the making, but they're human beings in the present. This is a convincing and important argument, but it's left the field grounded in a sort of unrelenting presentism. The focus is purely on children's present being. Now, this sits uncomfortably for me because I'm interested in efforts towards radical or progressive social transformation. As if you've read the paper, you will have seen implied in the critique that we put forward against ethno-nationalism, capitalism, and capitalist realism. And as we develop in the paper, efforts to social transformation are very much guided by visions of the future, what could be, what should be, what we would like to be, and how we might get there. So futures as evaluative frames and contingent outcomes. And I felt that the presentism, or I feel that the presentism within childhood studies doesn't adequately deal with these kinds of questions that relate to efforts to social transformation. So for me, the paper was an opportunity to think about childhood and temporality differently. And I found working with Judith really productive in this sense. I mean, she's brilliant, but also I think the sort of interdisciplinarity, which I also see embraced in the Epigenetic Ethics project, was really powerful and important for me. So Andrew Sayre, who's actually a geographer, he writes about, or he critiques the growing timidity of critical social sciences, which he says reduced to self-reflexivity and skepticism. And for me, working in a more interdisciplinary manner with Judith has provoked for me, and I hope what you see in the paper, is an impulse towards a reconstruction. So not just skepticism, but or even explanatory critique, but offering different ways of conceptualizing and orienting towards alternative futures, not simply describing and analyzing the problems that we currently face in popular discourses about the future. So those are some of my entry points into the field, and Judith is now going to speak to some of her own.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm assuming that everyone here has actually read the paper, so I'm not going to talk through the detail of the argument, but just to sort of recap some of what Rachel said, it was a really interesting experience to work through these different disciplinary orientations, because I think we started off being troubled by the same kind of things. I think we were both troubled by the implications in the public debate around May and Leadsom, but obviously much broader debate about who has a stake in the future and the way that parents were positioned in that sense. So for me, and I actually only realized this now as I was preparing my notes for this talk, actually there are three different areas of work that I've written and researched in for the past several years, and that might seem somewhat disparate. And I realized that in a way, the ideas that are articulated in this paper bring together these three areas of work, perhaps not entirely successfully, but that's sort of where I'm coming from. So one is an interest in political philosophy, particularly liberal theory and critiques of liberal theory. Another is my work on parent-child relationships, which Emma mentioned, a lot of which was done with Stefan Ramaekers, who's here, and particularly on the pedagogical aspect of parent-child relationships and the ethical quality of those relationships and how they fit in with sort of bigger ethical and political concerns. And a third interest of mine is the field of utopian studies, and this comes out of my work on anarchist theory. So I think to an extent I'm trying to sort of weave together all these different questions, and I think as Rachel will probably explore more in the next few slides, part of what we're doing in the paper is really articulating the tensions that seem to be present between the often sort of contradictory ways in which different agents are positioned in relation to the future. So on the one hand, there is this idea that being a parent gives one a sort of a stake in the future. And this is very much sort of out there in the public discourse. But then if you look at the way the future is theorized in actual academic work, particularly in political philosophy, there seems to be a real tension here. So on the one hand, I think there's an attempt to theorize the question of intergenerational justice, and often this is in relation to really important political issues like climate change and so on. But this tends to get reduced to questions of extrapolating from our present into a sort of imagined future in which the actual normative basis of the present is not really called into question. So I think that in most mainstream philosophical work where the future is talked about, there's a positioning of parents, but a weird contradiction in the way parents are positioned. So on the one hand, the future is seen as a kind of empty space, and parents in this sense are asked to send their children, as it were, into this space, preparing them as much as possible for it, whilst at the same time being held responsible for the future by nature of being parents and having a stake in it. Right. So yeah, so thanks. This slide is a sort of collection of quotes that I found from various popular websites aimed at parents, where the general message is, we don't know what the future is going to look like. Right? So what you have to do as a parent, your responsibility as a parent, is to prepare your child as best as possible for this hugely uncertain, rapidly changing future. So again, the future here is this kind of empty space. It's not something that we're actually constructing, but rather something that's just out there, almost separate from us. And yet at the same time, in political philosophy, the future is seen as a sort of extrapolation of contemporary political institutions. So you see this particularly in liberal theory, in the versions of liberal theory that have grown out of Rawls's theory of justice and related ideas. So to the extent that there are important normative questions to ask about what the future will look like in terms of justice, inequality, and responsibility, these tend to sort of normalize particular types of institutions and relationships in the present, whether it's through particular individuals having responsibility towards future generations through their offspring, which is what Rawls refers to as the motivational assumption, or whether through an assumption that the basic structure of society as we know it is just going to sort of continue into the future, and the focus therefore is not on what needs changing in the present, but on how our responsibility to future generations will be cashed out in terms of sort of present relationships. So I think I'll stop there and let Rachel pick up.
Judith has talked in some ways about the way these public discourses position parents and the implications that they have for parenting practices in relation to the future. But one of the things we were interested in thinking about is, what's this mean for other groups? So we write in the article about the way that non-parents in these discourses are viewed as simply having no socio-political interest or commitment to the future. Safransky's, the German philosopher's comment, I think sharply exemplifies this. For the childless, thinking in terms of the generations to come loses relevance. So this idea that if you don't have direct descendants through which you can project your own immorality and imagine the consequences of your present day actions or extrapolate a future from, you are certainly of high risk, but you also have no particular impetus to be thinking about the future in any sort of a way. What Edelman refers to as a reproductive futurism and relationship to the future. In the paper, one of the things we do is analyze the problematics of this kind of a position in relation to non-parents, just that it's discriminatory and can be quite pathologizing of those who don't reproduce, or where sexual desire is not related to reproduction. But it also does something else. It naturalizes the parent-child relationship as the only, or at least the primary way that adults and children relate to each other, effectively turning non-parents into strangers. So we see the rise of a kind of stranger danger ethos. And one of the points we make in the paper is that what ends up happening here is a sort of privatization of the future within these arguments that are based on liberal and neoconservative and very Eurocentric notions of family and kinship, because they're based on the assumption that the only reason we have to care about something is because it's our own. And our own in these sort of discourses is the quite small nuclear family nucleus. Now, it might seem, one of the other points that we look at in the paper is what do these discourses do to children in childhood? It might seem that something about the future and who has claims to the future centers children in childhood. But it's not so much that children have claims to the future as that their ontological status as the future, which populates these popular imaginaries. And likewise, to the extent that children feature at all in philosophical work on intergenerational justice, it's typically in the sense that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which childhood studies has sort of firmly critiqued, the sense that children are yet to be adults who inhabit the future that we, contemporary adults, bequeath to them. So this, as I said, has been critiqued, this idea that children are simply anticipatory beings. It is a way of kind of erasing agency, impact, and their ability to speak for the future in the present moment. One of the other points that we make is even in these discourses where children are positioned ontologically as the future, some, and particularly subaltern children, may be positioned as having no future at all. So not only are they rendered unable to speak for the future, but having no future at all. So in asking the question, whose future is part of these popular discourses, we've suggested that rooting claims to the future in a particular social position, parent, non-parent, child, inevitably involves undercutting other subjects' claims to the future. And that often one can be held responsible for the state of the future in a kind of neoliberal responsibilization model, but simultaneously rendered unable to speak for the future or even rendered futureless. We also argue, and I think Judith was getting at this already in some of her comments, that there's a dangerous abstraction that happens. So we occlude the ways in which our experience of the world is already deeply constituted by unjust social relations, relations that shape people's presence and connectedly the futures that they are able to imagine, desire, and speak for. But these are abstracted, these present day situations are abstracted as we think about the future in these very idealized forms. In the paper, we just think about whose future. So we've kind of critiqued the idea that there's individuals or social positions that have particular claims to the future. But we also consider what future underpins many of these narratives, such as Lisanne's claims to having a stake in the future that Theresa may not. I mean, one of the things we see that I think Judith talked a lot about is the way that the future in these discourses represents an inevitable continuation of the present, an already existing social and political reality, whether this is Britain, capitalism, the liberal institution of the family. And the very phrase, the future, implies a logical connection with already defined political and social ways of thinking and being. And one of the points that we make is in so doing and abstracting the future, extrapolating the future in this way, it forecloses the possibility to think about alternatives or radically different ways of thinking about the futures. The ethical locus of the discussion in the philosophical literature, but also in popular discourse, is about individual choices in the present. But at the same time, one of the things that we note is the dominance of discussions of the future and the kind of present moment. And particularly within a financialized capitalism, The idea that the future is simultaneously and perhaps paradoxically takes shape as overflowing with possibilities, and therefore deeply indeterminate and uncertain. So, Lisa Atkins writes about the ways in which the preferred subject of financialized capital is not debt repaying, constant and consistent, but the preferred subject is increasingly speculative, innovative, and creative, constantly imagining and orienting towards potential futures. Now, it may seem that this is very different, but one of the points that we're trying to make here is that the future has also become so abstracted in these sorts of accounts. It's abstracted here in the sense not as an extrapolation, but as a seemingly endless impossibility. But these futures are animated by timeless assumptions of capitalism, of debt, and class relations as they currently manifest. Without such assumptions, the speculative market kind of crumbles. So there's a sense in which many of these underpinning features that currently exist will still make up a part of whatever potential futures are out there. We also point to the ways that the abstraction happens by pointing to some far, far away distant horizon, which makes the present day actions of contemporary agents and their actions to produce futures almost unevaluable, that we can't see the impact of our actions. And indeed, this gets obscured in these discussions of speculation. So both of these ways of thinking about the future in popular discourses around these questions around claims to the future, or just more generally around the futures, have this odd effect of focusing our attention distant hypothetical futures. And the point we make is that they shut down spaces in which radically different depictions of the futures can be imagined, articulated, and enacted. And importantly, they distract us from the political demands of the present. So we have, rather than an unrelenting presentism, we end up with an unrelenting futurism that's so distant and far away from us. And so the kind of current day situations which so deeply affect the possible futures become obscured or erased and make it difficult for people to articulate the kind of futures they want and which are demanding of urgent attention. And that brings us to some of the final points in our argument.
So yeah, so in the final section, I guess what we try to do is sort of tie all these strands together and suggest that utopian theory can offer perhaps a useful way of thinking of an alternative imaginary. So Rachel used the phrase imaginary before, and I think there's a really important sense in which our political concepts and ideas have an imaginary depth, right? We create we create ways of seeing the world through imagining the sort of content of these different concepts we use. And I think utopian studies has interesting tools in this regard. And this might seem slightly paradoxical because we've been critiquing the idea of the future as this sort of abstraction. And sometimes people hearing the word utopia often associate it with the realm of fantasy and fiction, and there is a kind of pejorative association with the word utopia that is something so far removed from the present that it's sort of in the realm of fantasy. But in fact, utopian studies, I think, has some really interesting theoretical resources for emphasizing the important critical function of utopian imagination as a way of what Bauman calls relativizing the present. So the function of utopias in the form of a way of thinking of a different, better future is precisely to point out what are the issues of injustice or oppression in the present, and could we imagine a world or a place in which they're maybe not fully resolved, but at least mitigated by things that we do now in the present. And that's, I think, the important aspect of utopian theory that Ruth Levitas draws attention to in her recent work on utopia as method, where, as she points out, the very act of speculating about how things could be better forces us to pay attention to the fact that our present institutions, our present social, political, economic arrangements are contingent. They are the product of human agency. And it's precisely by acting differently, by creating new ways of being in the present, that we can collectively not just imagine, but also hopefully start to bring about a different kind of future. And I think just thinking in that sense about what the future and what the sort of social imaginary of the future can be helps us redirect our attention away from the future, either as a sort of extrapolation of you know, contemporary conceptions of justice or of financialization or whatever it might be, or as a purely private sort of subjective notion of responsibility that we have to particular others who we're related to, and it transforms it into a sort of dynamic, ongoing exercise of political imagination, if you want. So I think probably that's enough to say at this point. I mean, I think hopefully what we've done here is lay out the tensions that we're grappling with and some of the ideas that we think still need exploration. And yeah, this slide helpfully reminds me that it was actually while we were writing the paper that the student climate change marches really sort of came to, you know, to public attention. And I think the involvement of often really young children in these marches does challenge some quite dominant ways of thinking about children as political agents, but also in a way what it does is sort of throw back at us the assumption that we as adults have some sort of collective responsibility to look after children in terms of making sure that their future is protected by the institutions we've set up in the present, right? So I think the debates around the climate marches often took the form of people, you know, those who weren't enthusiastic about them often were expressing the concern that these children were sort of throwing away their personal futures by missing out on school to go out marching, right? And there's an assumption here that we know what's best for children by assuming that the institutions that we've set up will protect them against unemployment or whatever it is. But I think in a way what the climate change marches did was show the sort of vacuousness of those ideals of the future, because they called into question the very assumptions that underlie the sort of political structures that we're attempting to induct children into, if you want. So there's a whole set of questions, I think, that are raised by some of these recent social movements and activism. But I'll stop there because I'm looking forward to people's questions.
Thank you both for this really nice introduction to the paper. I don't want to keep the respondents waiting too long, but maybe we can take a few moments to see if there are any questions for clarification or other short questions. And if there aren't, then we can just start with the first response by Harriet Bergman. And Harriet is a PhD researcher affiliated to the University of Antwerp as well. And in her research, she is developing a new and nuanced philosophical understanding of the role of feelings of discomfort in climate change activism. And I look forward to hearing her response.
Yeah. Thank you, Judith, and thank you, Rachel, for the paper, and also thank you, Emma, and the NeuroEpigenetic group for giving me the opportunity to respond. I wanted to focus in my response. While reading it, I was most interested in what your insights mean for efforts of social transformation. So that's where I sort of built my thoughts around. And I wanted to go shortly into two things. The first is, what subject position do people speak of when they speak of the future, but also this is a similar problem when people speak of the present. And the second thing I wanted to touch upon was the concept of prefiguration, because I thought that links very much with utopianism and speculative thinking. And I just wanted to question that a bit. So the first part, sort of about what subject position you think of, I really had to really reminded me of this statement that you also hear lots in the climate movement. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, by Ursula K. Le Guin. And that's statements similar to statements like our future is in our hands, sort of really leaves out the victims climate change or climate breakdown is already making at the moment. So if we see children or adults or adolescents at climate marches fighting on behalf of their future, that's also from a subject position that is leaving out the victims that are already caused by climate breakdown. So I was sort of thinking about how I wanted to know more about how speaking on behalf of the future is different from speaking on behalf of the present, and whether those are the same sort of issues or not. So that was my first question. The second is really on where prefiguration, whether that could be a concept that's helpful or not, because I really see with prefiguration is of course foreshadowing the world you want to see. So it's both an anarchist concept, but with theological roots. There you have problems of who is actually prefiguring, who has the time to, I don't know, go to action camps or start a general assembly and talk there. And if that is, if the group that comes together to prefigure the world they want to be in, if they are doing that, is that not exclusionary in other ways? Because on the one hand, I see that prefiguring makes a lot of sense, but at the same time, if your anarchist space is not wheelchair accessible, or if there's no childcare available at this activist meeting, what does it really mean to prefigure this new world? So yeah, that were two sort of things I wanted to bring up. Do I still have a lot of time left? Or
I can say something about prefiguration, but I don't know, Rachel, do you want to tackle the other part of the question?
Perfect.
Should I go first on the prefiguration issue? I think that is, I mean, they're all really important points. On the prefiguration, I think prefigurative politics have come in for quite a hard time recently. So I don't know if you know, there's a recent work by Srnic and Williams, Reinventing the Future, where they're very critical of the kind of prefigurative politics or the prefigurative political approach that was adopted by social movements like Occupy, for example, which they see as failing to offer a really worked out alternative to neoliberal capitalist hegemony, right? So they argue that we need a kind of utopian politics that's not just prefigurative, that's not horizontal, but that is much more strategic in how it aims to, destabilize and offer alternatives to existing systems. And so I think it's easy to see the idea of prefigurative politics as a kind of, sort of lifestyle, sort of rather apolitical, if you want, sort of, very horizontal forms of just community-based, what Hakim Bain calls, temporary autonomous zones sort of activities. But I think actually, from my point of view, and this is one of the things I'm working on at the moment with anarchist theory, I think that if you look at the pedagogical aspect of it, actually it then becomes much more aligned with the kind of thing we're talking about, because most of these prefigurative projects do have, or at least should have, a pedagogical role as well, in which there is also a kind of act of political education. So I think prefiguration, in order for it to serve the critical purpose that you want it to serve, it also has to involve an act of pedagogical and critical engagement with ideas and political imaginaries of the present. It's not enough to just sort of, set up a camp in a square and say that you're abolishing capitalism. I mean, that's the kind of caricature of Occupy, right? But I think to the extent that there was something else going on there, it was also, there was some really serious sort of pedagogical process of not just critiquing current systems, but also setting up alternative ways of democratic decision making, for example. So then the very concept of democracy becomes the focus of a form of political education. And I think that should all be part of, whatever project you're involved in that's aimed at social change. So I think prefiguration, certainly it's vulnerable to the kind of problems that you indicate, but I think it also has resources to do more than just reinscribe problematic aspects of our political reality. I don't know if that goes some way towards answering it. I'll see if
Yeah, definitely.
Rachel, do you want to?
Harriet, okay, sure, yeah.
Unless you want to come back on that, Harriet, I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
No, I'm looking forward to the next answer.
So thanks really a lot for those both of the comments, questions. I think the subject position one is one in which, the argument our paper is making is that fundamentally positions which link a singular subject position to claims for the future, they're fundamentally, essentially exclusionary. And so what we're trying to do in the paper is think about whether there might be other ways in which we can articulate, enact, imagine relations to the future which don't root it in a speaking subject position. I'd have to think a little bit more about this, but I think a similar claim is probably helpful in terms of thinking about the present. So I'm not sure that I would make a distinction between present and future here. Where I think we try and go, and I think we've both kind of hinted that we don't feel we got far enough in our thinking on this, but where I think we tried to go was to think about the idea, if we don't have claims to the future by a subject position, how is it that we can still think about the potential of social transformation? And we propose a sort of an idea around an intergenerational encounters of utopia as method, in Levitas's terms, as a critique of the present, as well as imaginaries of possibilities. But that's something which might be as through democratic structures like Judith has just talked about, but through various ways of thinking this together as a collective project. And I think that's the kind of position that we were moving towards. So rather than a subject position, that it's about a collective project of engagement. Where I think there's a sort of naivety maybe to this, or less developed, is what might that look like? And particularly if we're thinking around these questions around children and adults, I think it's a naivety in the sense that generational power relations mean that in any kind of an intergenerational encounter, so you can see in Jessica Taft's work, for example, in the Peruvian choking children's movement. It's an intergenerational movement led by child workers with support from adults. But it raises all sorts of thorny questions about who's leading, what sorts of pedagogical functions different people play, what sorts of interaction happen that can't escape the power relations within that grouping. And so I think, to me, that those are some of the questions that I feel we didn't necessarily get to enough in the paper, or that might be a sort of future step. But I think that the kind of point about it's not about a privateer linked to a subject position in order to think about futures is sort of helpful for movements of social transformation. But look forward to your response.
Yeah, I really I really agree, and I really see that. And I'm personally sort of struggling to find a way to build not only like vertical solidarity, but also horizontal solidarity, which I think, yeah, works similar, but has different power dynamic problems and different, emancipatory problems in the whole, whatever the word is. And it really made me, it's just how abstracting away from certain positions always leaves people out, really made me think like what is there to do. Of course, it's not directly sitting on a square saying we are the 99%, and it's not what has been done so far, but it's just something I'm really looking for, like in what way can you build can you make both future claims but also claims about now, and also it's I really had to think a lot of Jose Munoz while reading your paper, where it's really like, how do we move from the here and now to the then and there? What is the build of? And Munoz, of course, works very much with the aesthetic. So he says that in queer aesthetics, you see beyond the totalizing rendering of the here and now towards a utopian possibility, and that queerness is always on the horizon, always something we move towards. And that was really something that I think that the goal, putting a goal makes it easier, or putting a point on the horizon makes it easier to formulate a we, because it's not necessarily from a subject position, but walking towards something that brings the people together, which is why I like the utopian thinking and working with the prefiguration thing. But so far I've just been really happy with both your responses and the paper, and I think I have to pass it on to someone else. I'm looking at Emma now. But yeah, thank you so much for this so far.
Could I just say something more on just while you were speaking, Harriet? I thought, I feel like the current COVID situation that we're all dealing with has actually thrown up some really interesting examples of this. So there have been in England, and I'm sure this is the case wherever you are as well, various grassroots community-based initiatives for things like food distribution, support for vulnerable people in communities, that sprung up really, really quickly in the first few weeks of the pandemic. And often the people who are putting these together and presenting them were articulating something like a kind of prefigurative politics. Often there was a kind of quite radical political imaginary behind this, that actually what we're doing is completely reimagining the state and, showing how grassroots, community-based organizations can replace state institutions, and sort of prefiguring, if you want, a kind of anarchist utopia, right? But of course there were real tensions there, because some of the groups were working with existing social political organizations where they were getting, the records of the people in the community. So some were working with the police, some were working with, health authorities, for example, local authorities, which of course then brought up all sorts of problems about which kinds of people were excluded, who didn't count, citizens who were not on a register because they're not, based in registered in a particular locality. And I think this is a really important debate. But what I found particularly interesting was that, although I might have tended to side with the anarchist collectives here, after speaking to people who were involved with working with city councils, for example, on issues of homelessness, which of course has become a much more massive issue than it even was before under COVID, what happened was that some city councils very quickly managed to find solutions to homelessness, right, through existing networks, right, because they wanted people off the street, because it was a public health crisis, right? And one of the things that someone said to me was, well, at least now they're not going to be able to go back to saying we can't solve the problem, right? We've shifted the discourse, even by working in a way which actually does engage with existing institutions and structures and doesn't completely, try and work alongside them to prefigure something different. You can still do something quite radical if this is to be believed, because it now becomes much harder in that public space to say, oh, we can't possibly solve the problem of homelessness. So I think there needs to be a kind of thinking on both levels there. And I think the pandemic has thrown up some really interesting examples of how that works.
Thank you all for this conversation, Harriet, for your response. Yeah, we will go on to the next response, but before I would like to see if there's still a question or comment from the audience. We don't have much time, but if someone has a question, please share it with us. I see there's a question from Thomas. Go ahead.
Hi, hello. I have to go really quickly, so it's not a question. It's just I just want to say thank you to both the speakers and the people who've spoken so far. I guess you can all hear me because no one's pulling any weird faces. Okay. I wrote my master thesis on disability theoretic utopias with Edelman, Butler, Munoz being key figures. And I wrote it in a department which had no expertise on this, so it often felt like I was just like searching for kind of common cause. So it's just amazing to hear people talking about it so kind of interestingly and yeah. So thank you very much. I'm gonna have to go straight away, but thank you. And I will watch it when it's on YouTube. Okay, people are nodding. Cool. Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. Bye. Okay, then we will go on to the second response by Leni. And Leni is a postdoc. Leni van Goidsenhoven is a postdoc in the NeuroEpigenetics project. She is trained in cultural and literary studies, and she works on the intersection of disability studies, new feminist materialism, cultural studies, and literary theory. Leni, you can go ahead.
Hi, and also from me, very thankful. I'm very thankful that I could read the paper that Emma brought it up to our team meetings. And while reading, some things popped up in my head. So it's not really questions, but rather some issues to spark some discussion with the audience as well. So you could all interrupt me or ask a question, etc. Also, I had 3 questions in my mind, and I think the third one relates to what is already asked by Harriet and how you did respond, because it's about community. But first thing I noticed while reading that you look at how the child, the precious child, functions in popular imagery as the embodiment of the future. And then you convincingly make the argument that the parent of this child has a unique stake in that popular imagery to the future, and that the family, so parent and child, is a coded reference to a middle class, heteronormative nuclear family, as you mentioned as well in the introduction. But I thought that it's maybe even more than that, and that we can make that explicit by stating that it's also a white and able child, that a white and able middle-class heteronormative nuclear family. And I wondered that would something happen if you take up that notion of ableness in the imagery of the child, or would something happen if you take up disability somewhere? And then a second thing was you use Edelman's book of No Future, which is a seminal book in queer theory. And Edelman, you write, argues that heteronormativity and the child serves as a constitutive limits of our understandings of the possibilities of communal relations and ways of orienting ourselves to the world. Then Edelman offers an interesting way of addressing the problematics of attaching a stake in the future to the social position of parenthood, you write. He calls for an embrace of queerness there and the death drive. And he rejects the fantasy of the future and the future itself. And for your claim, this disrupting of the false promise of linear progress is interesting, as well as how he critiques the nuclear family with its focus on reproduction. But however, you don't follow his complete negation of the future, because that runs the risk of neoconservative incorporation. But of course, of this reclaiming, we could say, of negativity with Lehmann is because of a specific context and history as well, especially the AIDS epidemic, where people were dying and were granted no future because of the government did not want to invest in healthcare for AIDS patients nor in AIDS research. And I wondered if you just could collaborate on the context of that work and how that can get a place in your argument. And is that context and history not important in Edelman's argument? And then the third one more relates to what you already commented upon. So in the text sometimes seems to look for alternative notions of kinship, of community, communal relations, but it's not always that explicit. I have read this implication because you draw on queer theory, and maybe here crip would also be interesting, crip theory. And then you also take in that ableness or the disabledness. But also in the way you write about the danger of linking parenthood to the future and how that individualizes our relationship to the societies we live in, and how you write about the danger of care as a private concern and focuses on care as something collective. And it was also implicit for me in the question where the whole discussion leaves children as unfinished. You also mentioned that in the introduction, and that also is a reference to childhood studies who work with voices of children and about discussions of what is it, the unfinishing of children, and how can we deal with it. Is this implication intended, and did you look into this issue? Is queer theory or crip theory then interesting for you to look for alternatives way of kinship, of caring? So yeah, I was trying to draw the paper more towards disability studies and crip theory, I think, in a way.
Shall I respond, Emma? Yes. Yeah. Leni, thank you so much for those comments. I think they're fascinating and important questions, and a lot of questions. So, I mean, I think your points around disability are extremely important. If we look at the ways in which the child is figured as a trope of the not yet, the becoming future, this is viewed with a really teleological developmental narrative that's incredibly dominant, right? So the idea of the individual developing child towards maturity, towards greater cognitive abilities, et cetera, all of these kind of developmental narratives, I think, position, take as at their core a normalized, able-bodied child, and everyone else, be they developing, becoming in different ways because of sociocultural diversity, because of diversities around ableness and so forth, they get viewed as the exterior, the outside to this normalized view of the child. So we have, I think on the one hand, you're right, or I think what you're pointing to is this idea of the child as the embodiment of the future holds a very, very particular, quite singular notion of who that child is. And so I think it is a useful point that you're bringing in here, that disability can help us think against those sort of teleological notions around development and so forth. We took this point up, you know, to sort of exemplify these issues around migration and thinking about the way in which the ethno-nation gets framed around the future. But I think there's important conversations to be had about the way, about how disability can, and disability theory can help us think about futures. Judith, shall I just carry on, or did you want to add anything to that? Okay. So then I see your next 2 points are inviting us to think more with queer theory, I think, in particular. And so hands up, I don't work largely with queer theory, so it isn't my particular orientation in relation to my work. But I think there are lots of productivities here. And I think one of the things we're trying to say in the paper, which I'll just kind of specifically hone in on, is that Edelman's arguments do make a really compelling and important case against the future as a reproductive futurism. And while the context of his work around the AIDS epidemic, I think, is an important part of his framing, even amongst AIDS activists, there were, of course, varying ideas about the ways in which they did and do articulate the politics of their movements. And so one of the, I think the sort of broader concerns that we're raising about some of his work is that we're taking a position around social transformation that does imply some engagement with ideas of futures, that's an important way. So again, back to Levitas's work, that futures and engagement with futures is an important way that we can method for evaluating the present and evaluating the ways in which our actions in the present might change or challenge and produce a new future. So those imaginaries serve as an evaluative tool as well as a potential goal. So I think you're right that the context of his work matters, but I think we can also see that this is a debate within social movement literature and within social movements themselves about the ways in which we orient our actions towards social transformation. Judith, did you want to jump in on that point?
No, not really, but I do think that part of what Leni was saying is a really important antidote to other really sort of more sinister versions of utopian thinking, right? So utopianism is not a province of you know, anarchist or left-wing social movements, right? There are utopias that are actually tied in a lot of, you know, alternative popular imagery to this sort of ideal of human perfection that is, you know, arguably now held out to us by advances in you know, biomedical science and you know, human, you know, in genetics research and so on, where the ideal is that actually we could have a future where we could, you know, create a sort of, you know, perfect model of humans without any disability, right? I mean, these are the sort of darker, more sinister utopias that have been proposed and I think in the context of certainly of disability studies, critical disability studies, it's really important to think about whose lives are worth living and worth valuable in the present before we start sort of imagining a perfect future. So I would definitely see the sort of areas that you're talking about as a really important element in working out just which utopias are actually about offering a livable life for everybody in the present and not actually sort of creating a hierarchy of different types of lives. But I don't, yeah, I like Rachel, I'm sort of, I think in fact even more than Rachel, I'm quite ambivalent about the Edelman sort of framing of these issues, but I think there are useful conceptual points there.
Leni, do you want to respond to this? Or if there's anyone else in the audience who wants to ask a question, now is the time. We have room for, I think, one question now, and then we go on to the next response.
I don't really have an answer, but it's interesting to hear you talk about it and how you immediately can think with that, with the concept of disability in the context of your work. And
you made one other point. Oh, sorry.
No, I also think that the conversation between your work about the children in camps with disability studies can be interesting. Think about future or developmental narratives. But I'm never studied that of something, but something that triggers me lately. And the non-Western also view on disability and
Thank you, Leni, for your response. We can now go on to the next one, and I think perhaps if people have questions, they can also be asked after that, because the responses are a bit related, I think. So the next response is by Lisanne Meinen, and she very recently joined our University of Antwerp research team. And in her PhD project, she uses methodologies from disability studies and empirical philosophy to investigate what we can learn from video games regarding the experience of a psychiatric diagnosis, especially of autism, psychosis, and depression. And I will now give the word to her.
All right, so hello everyone. Many thanks for your paper and for the discussion so far. I think the reading the paper has really inspired me to think creatively about how we can imagine those alternative and just futures that you mentioned. And in my response, I would like to address two ideas that I think you hinted in your text. So the first is the potential of including non-human agents in imagining just alternative futures. And secondly, I would like to make more explicit the role of art and fiction in imagining and producing those futures. So in the text, you identify how the current linking of parenthood to the future individualizes our relationship to the societies we live in. It represents a privatization of the future. And it is based on the assumption that the only reason we have to care about something is because it affects us or our own. And I was immediately thinking that if we look at this from an environmental perspective, if it is possible to extend this idea of the privatization of the future to the way in which, generally speaking, of course, in our current society, we only care about the future of the planet because it affects our own human species. So said otherwise, could the discussion of who the future belongs to be enriched by not only speaking about humans, but also about non-human agents and their future? And I think that including non-human agents in the discussion about alternative futures would hopefully not mean adding just another group that can have a stake in the future, but hopefully it would also help us to nuance the privileged position of the human in general, and by extension, of course, also of those humans that are currently privileged and that you discuss in the paper. And I think this also relates to what Harriet was saying earlier about how there are subjects that are already being harmed by climate change. So I think my response is quite long, so I just briefly want to mention that I saw an interesting connection also with the ideas of Donna Haraway here. So in her work, Staying with the Trouble, she writes about the importance of kinship. Leni also mentioned this. So she says how making kin with the more than human world is an urgent ethical responsibility. And I think this could be a bit of a more concrete way to think about including non-human agents as well. And then for my second point, well, you say that it is important to not only linger in abstract theory, but also bring in concrete ideas about alternative futures. And then, of course, you introduce the idea of utopian thinking, which has both a cognitive and an affective element. And I would like to make the role of imagination and cultural objects a bit more explicit here. I think cultural objects such as novels, artworks, or also video games, of course, they are both effective and able to convey ideas. So I think this is what makes them very crucial, because they can help us to imagine alternative futures while also letting us interrogate the privileged position of certain human agents in these debates at the same time. So they allow us to trace all these issues non-reductively, because they are capable of offering multiple viewpoints and even time scales at the same time. And of course, it's important to remain having an explicit attention to who hears those diverse stories, since of course there are a lot of imaginaries of the future that are still denied value. For example, in the literary world, there are still a lot of problems of accessibility, so making it difficult for non-Western writers to reach a general audience. However, I would hope that the creative act of imagination is very accessible, and yeah, that will help somehow. So for the discussion, I would just be really interested in hearing if you considered non-human agents when writing your text, and if you think, like me, that this could enrich maybe the argument. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on the role of fiction, maybe as a more accessible way to let those whose voices are often not heard participate in those discussions about alternative and just futures. Thank you.
I can say something about the non-human agents, but I need to think a lot more about this. But my intuitive response as a philosopher is that that's actually a really problematic notion, because I think agency is a human notion. I mean, humans act. And so if we're talking about our ability as humans to act on the world, to change the world, which is a moral and a political project, then that is by definition a human concept, and it's something embedded in our language and our social being as humans. So I feel very sort of uncomfortable with the idea of non-human agents, which is not to say that we shouldn't care about non-human animals, but to me this wouldn't radically shift the sort of moral normative force of what we're saying, because I think that moral normative force is rooted in our being as social human beings in a social human environment. And to the extent that we need to take account of other life forms and with whom we share the planet, we can't do so without thinking about how we interact with them as humans in the social world that we've partly constructed, right? So I can't really make sense of that. I'm sorry, as a philosopher. I mean, I do think that in the end, when it comes down to specific questions about, for example, not destroying the habitat of certain species that are in danger of extinction, which of course we should be thinking about, right? But I don't think those questions are completely independent from questions about the human and social world that environment is already part of, right? So the people making the decision about this are humans, and the people both affected by and causing the environmental problems are humans. So I can't, I think if we're talking about agency, we're talking about humans. But that's just my intuitive response. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about this, and I'd have to, think that there are other really important things you said that I need to think more about. But that would be my first sort of stab at where I would come at from this. I think it would be a different project. I mean, it would be a different paper to talk about the issues that you're raising. But Rachel might want to say something about the other points, or she might want to disagree with me about that.
No, I think around agency, I would probably land in a similar kind of position. But Lisanne, I think you're raising a really important point about the ways in which, that it's not just social positions, one's social position that excludes from conversations about the future, from thinking about the future, from claims to the future. But I think one of the points that you're making here that's really helpful is a decentering of humanness. So this only matters, the point you made that this only matters, climate change only matters because it affects humans. And I think your point is really, really well placed, that part of the enlarging a conversation about alternate futures needs to decenter humans, would be my kind of thoughts in response to that point. And I think that could be a really productive conversation. In terms of imagination and producing futures, I think that's a really exciting area and a really exciting point. My own work hasn't been so much about art and fiction, but actually imaginative play. And so I've written and thought about the idea of children's imaginative play, but also intergenerational play as a way in which play is often understood as a kind of socialization, as a developmental phase, as a way of reproducing what is seen outside and then just doing that in play. But I'm much more inspired by thinking about imaginative play as a way of building, making worlds. It's an act of doing that together. And in order to do that, Cindy Katz argues, we immediately relativize the world. We immediately see the world as being constituted through social action, through people's action and through people's interaction with the natural world. So that it serves that kind of utopian impulse of relativizing the world. I think it brings into perspective, brings multiple perspectives. It can bring multiple perspectives into play. It gives people an opportunity to try things differently, to become, as utopian theory encourages, to become something different. Now, I don't want to idealize it. It does also reproduce all sorts of problematic things, but I think it offers a little bit of a space for something new and something different. And for me, with a focus coming from childhood studies, I think it's particularly relevant because it's a space of relativizing the world that doesn't demand rational speech, that is deeply effective, cognitive, and embodied. The body is centrally a part of imaginative play in the ethnographic work that I've done with very young children. And so I think it offers a way of doing this in a way that I think a lot of the arts and fiction that you might be talking about might exclude those who can't read, for example. So play, or whatever, that's a question, maybe that's a question we would want to think about, is who has access to these forms of these artistic forms or imaginative forms. But I think play would be something else, that imaginative play would be something I would add to that mix about the space of play in order to relativize the world and imagine other possibilities. So thank you.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, I agree. I think it's a really important point, the value of the arts particularly and literature. In an educational context, though, I would say that there's an important pedagogical dimension to that, right? So there is a concern recently in this country and maybe also in Belgium, I don't know, about the lack of space given in school curriculums to the arts and literature and creativity at the expense of more sort of instrumental view of what's educationally valuable. But even if you put the arts and literature on the curriculum, there's a way of engaging with them that allows them to I think perform this function of what Maxine Green talks about, releasing the imagination, right? So certainly literature and the arts have that potential, as Rachel was just describing, but if they're not taught in a way that opens up the sort of pedagogical space for that kind of imaginative play, then they can get reduced to just another form of, reinscribing ideas about the present, or just a purely technical exercise in, analyzing text. So certainly they should be part of any discussion about the future. And that, of course, in utopian literature, fiction is a really important part of the genre of utopian literature and has a critical function. I mean, the first sort of famous example of utopian, Thomas More's Utopia, which was a 16th century fiction, the novel performed, I think, a really important critical function of drawing people's attention to what was wrong with their current reality. although it might not necessarily always have come across that way. So yeah, I think that is an important point and something that probably there's a lot more to be said about. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisanne, for your excellent and very thought-provoking response, I think, and thanks for the answers. Before we go on to the last response, we won't wait long because we don't have too much time left in the workshop. I want to leave room for one question or comment. So if there's anyone who wants to say something or wants to ask a question, you can just go ahead or put a message in the chat. Leni, do you want to say something?
Yes, I wanted to come back on the notion of agency, maybe. And I think maybe it's it depends also how you conceptualize the subject, because you can have the idea that Mark exists because he throws the ball, of Mark exists and he throws the ball, or you can have a subject conceptualization that's more present in new materialism, for instance, that the ball is there, and because of Mark is throwing the ball, he exists and has agency on that in that moment. But then there is a very specific relation between the ball and Mark. Yeah, Christine.
Yes, I was also thinking about the agency and the non-human entities, and I'm with Leni. I think that I would agree that I would also ascribe, from a new materialist perspective, more agency to also non-human entities as well. So, but yeah, that's maybe, yeah, it's probably something that requires a wider discussion.
Yeah, I suggest, thank you for the comments. I suggest that we go on to the next response, and if people want to discuss particular topics further, they can do so after the workshop itself, can just hang around and dive into the topics if they have time. But now it's time for our final response of this afternoon by Stefan Ramaekers. And Stefan is a professor at the Laboratory for Education and Society of the KU Leuven. And his research is situated in the field of educational philosophy at the intersection of Anglo-Saxon and continental philosophical traditions. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emma. Hi, Rachel. Hi, Judith. I think agency just became the elephant in the room. I'm not going to say anything about agency. Thank you for your paper. It gives a lot to think. And just a few things I want to say in response to that. So the tensions you're describing remind me very much of similar tensions in the tradition of theorizing the relationship between parent and child, at least in the continental educational philosophical tradition. So there are similar discussions about children being conceived as kind of continuations of present day status quo versus childhood conceived as the child as something with possibilities, and that being who's going to change everything, etc., etc. So kind of similar tensions in educational theorizing. What I want to focus on is your proposal towards the end of the paper that I'm really fascinated by, but that also, I mean, I'm not going to say I lost sleep over it. That's not true, but it kept me thinking all the time. So you say that, this is on page 137 of your paper. You focus on ethical responsibilities towards those with whom we share a present, where our ability to develop a concrete vision of something very different is part of a collective endeavor to address the grave social and environmental problems we face. And a bit further on, you then phrase this in terms of a collective intergenerational endeavor, with future thinking being primarily about radical reimagining, challenging the injustices of today, you say, in order to enact invaluable changes in the, between inverted commas, near future. So briefly, just three things I want to, three issues I want to raise. It's this phrase, first of all, with whom we share a present. Now, I understand that you're very careful in drawing out subjects' positions because of their potential exclusionary positions or implications. Apologies. But still, I'm a bit left towards the end of the paper. But what kind of subject position is implied here in this we? I feel like this needs a bit, this needs to be fleshed out a bit. Because I take it when you say with whom we share a present, that more is involved than the bare fact of inhabiting a particular planet. So there's a substantial concept of we at play, I guess, and a substantial concept of the present. But today's political tensions, and I don't think I have to point it out to anyone here, but today's political tensions have shown that there are very different conceptions of the present. And related to that, also very different understandings of what today's injustices are. Many of us do not live in the same present as others. I'm afraid this is the societal and political situation today. And this kind of also overflows to what constitutes we. Obviously, we conceptually only makes sense in relation to a not we, someone else. But politically, this has very grave consequences today. So I'm wondering, first of all, with whom we share a present. Is this something that, I mean, I feel this is something that needs to be fleshed out a bit more. I'm kind of left in a void towards the end. And if I'm not sure if this is going to work, but I'm going to try and share something. Yeah, this one. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this? Emma, I've got you in the picture.
Yeah,
so you
we can see it.
This is something that came across social media this morning. This is a bridge somewhere in Cleveland. Basically what people did is, I don't know if you can see this, so they put up stuff there, like a toothbrush, a blanket, soap. And the idea behind it was, well, I don't need this, but anyone who does, just take it with you and leave something else behind. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So I would say a particular we is maybe created there, a particular present, but maybe also an imaginary of a particular future. I don't know, is this one, it's maybe too grassroots, or we can easily critique this, but something is happening there. There is an appeal to a we and an appeal to a present and an appeal to a future. And I'm wondering how you would see this we and the present. Second, much shorter, intergenerational endeavor. What's your understanding of the child here? And I'm thinking in particular of the recent environmental movements and the responses to Greta Thunberg. You might recall people saying, well, shouldn't you be at school and blah, blah, she should be back at school and not doing it because she still needs to be educated. She's not an adult. Okay, she's back at school now. How much has changed? I'm not saying how much has changed in relation to political decision, but how much has changed towards our understanding of children, young persons? How serious have we taken that? And how serious have we taken that stage in life? And third, finally, this has drawn my attention, but I mean, you've brought it on yourself. You say the near future. Now, as someone who's a little bit at home in ordinary language philosophy, when you say near future, that signals to me that you're not having in mind the ordinary meaning of the concept. You have some special meaning in mind. So I'm interested in what is the special meaning of the near future. It's not presentism, it's not futurism, but what is this near future then? Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Judith and Rachel, you can respond, of course.
Yeah, I'm not sure where to, I think these are all really, really important points. I mean, I can say something about how I understood the we in the sort of arguments that we were developing, because I think underpinning a lot of the political points we're making is a sort of a set of assumptions which we probably don't articulate and defend in the paper, but a set of assumptions about pluralism and democracy. So I think probably there is an idea there that to the extent that there needs to be some collective project, this should be a collective project that's let's say more in the spirit of a kind of Deweyan version of democracy with you know, the diversity and the sort of epistemological challenges that come about from having to work with people who are actually very different from oneself, rather than a we that is sort of, you know, might be part of a pluralistic society, but in which they're very different spaces, each of which has its own we. So of course this is not something we work out in the paper, but if this was to have educational implications, for example, I think it will be much more in keeping with an ideal of a sort of local common school where, you know, people from different backgrounds sort of construct a community together, rather than sort of segregated different communities, each one of which then has a sort of collective responsibility to its own. But that's not something we fully worked out. So I guess it's just, you're right that it was kind of left hanging there. But I'm assuming that there is some sort of a notion of democracy that we would appeal to there. Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to come in on that, Rachel? Because I need to think about a lot of this probably.
Thanks so much for really, yeah, fascinating points. In terms of the we, I think you're right, it isn't work to work through. And maybe Judith and I are operating with slightly different we's. That's also potential. I'm quite influenced by Chandra Mohanty's work around solidarities. And so the idea that in forging, that solidarities are something that are not identity-based, but are contingent, and that a we is formed through the practice, through a common project, a project that is fragile, and therefore the we needs to work to maintain this, to debate, dialogue, and discuss it. But it's in the practice of doing the project that a we is formed. It's not a kind of abstracted ideal that prefigures the project or can be imagined out of it, because it is more of a process. So in mind, it was much looser we than I think it maybe reads as, but I think it's an important, or it's a we that needs to be worked towards. Just in terms of the point about near future, I think this is in some ways more of a referencing error than anything else. It's actually Geyer, who's an anthropologist, uses the term near future in her argument, and that's summarized earlier in the paper. But she's making the point that there's an evacuation of the near future, right? So there's the focus right now in the kind of contemporary moment on either the far past or the infinite horizon of the future. So we're taking it in, yeah, it's a referencing error. Apologies. But thank you for calling us on that. Or raising that. But I think it does raise questions that Geyer doesn't actually really develop, which is, how do we distinguish the near future from the infinite horizons of the future? I mean, I think her point is, it's something that we can evaluate. We can act in the world with a near future, but then evaluate the consequences of our actions. So that, I think that would be the way she frames it.
Should have seen that, but I was actually hoping for that you were going to explain a different kind of concept of the future. But anyway, I should have seen that. Sorry.
No, it's not your fault.
But we'd love to hear what you think. This is Geyer's, yeah. What were you hoping for?
No, I'm not hoping for something. It's interesting, the relationship that you make between present and a particular attendance to the present, and how attendance to the present actually invokes a particular future. it's kind of, I think it relates closely to what you said about, you know, your looser sense of we. It's something that is worked towards in practice. So the attending to the present and the let's say the construction of a we is at the same time a construction of a near future, you could say. And that's why I was so fascinated this morning. But this was just a lucky incident by this picture that was sent around on social media. Because there's a lot you can say about this, but I don't want to over philosophize this, but in a sense you could say this is a we that is being worked towards. A claim is made to a particular we, and also a claim is made in a very particular concrete sense to some near future, which could perhaps basically mean if you don't have a blanket, I mean, how can you start caring about bigger issues? You need a blanket first, for example. I'm gonna shut up.
Should I say something about the childhood question, the intergenerational? Because I have similar sort of questions left hanging and I think this is one of the points on which Rachel and I kind of struggled a little bit with our different disciplinary orientations, because although I've read some of the work in sociology of childhood, that's not really my field, and I'm, as Stefan knows, quite influenced philosophically by Arendt's conception of childhood, of natality, and about the really qualitative distinction between adults and children in the sense of children's newness and the relationship between adults as sort of representatives of the world and children as beings coming into the world with you know, a newness. And I think I'm not quite comfortable with going down the line of sort of erasing that sort of qualitative distinction between the child and the adult, even though I recognize how problematic it is to talk about the figure of the child without acknowledging all the sort of cultural and social, you know, assumptions that are built into that. So I think this might be a point where we perhaps purposely left it a bit vague, because we knew that we wouldn't ever, you know, but firstly we couldn't work that out fully in the paper, but I think we might differ slightly on that. So I think the Greta Thunberg case is a really interesting example, because there are, well, this is stuff that we've also talked about, Stefan, in our own work. There is still this question of adult responsibility that I think doesn't completely go out the window, even when you're faced with someone like Greta Thunberg, who is acting as a political agent in the world. I still think there is a question about the responsibility of the adults, not necessarily the specific adults caring for her, but the adults who are, in this sense, representative of the world into which she's, you know, growing up and, you know, wants to say something about. So I'm not really, I don't want to abandon the idea of an intergenerational contract or an intergenerational relationship as having something to do with a particular moral positioning of adults in relation to the world and in relation to children. Even though we might want to draw the boundary between child and, I don't know, adult at a slightly different point, but I wouldn't want to abandon that. But I think Rachel might have a slightly different take on this.
Yes, in short. And I think Judith's right. We set aside this question because it would be a book to come to something, I think, that we were both kind of satisfied with. I mean, my kind of coming out of childhood studies, my work within the field of sociology, childhood would immediately raises questions about, well, what does newness mean? So the assumption that it's the child that's new to the world, when in many contexts, it's actually can be an adult that's new to the world. They've just moved to a location. They're in an institution that is brand new to them, but the child has great familiarity with. So while I think newness and responsibility are important, I think, again, there's challenges when we start tying those to particular social positions. So when Judith and I have had this conversation before, and Judith talks about what about adult responsibility to children, I have two kind of directions that I would want to take. So one is about, well, what is the responsibility that we have each other, right? So including children within the realm of ethical and moral and political responsibility to others. And thinking through what that might mean. So rather than adult to child, and thinking about the ways in which children as a social group experience domination, are dominated, are often, I think we can consider in many ways an excluded social group, precocious in their tropic, in their symbolic form, but quite excluded in other sorts of ways from say contemporary political life. And so I think that adult responsibility might relate to questions around power within intergenerational relations, and that might be where questions I would situate the particular adult responsibility. So yeah, I think you've picked up, Stefan, on exactly some of the areas where we do have these quite distinct positions. And then that has implications for how some of the earlier questions or points people raise. So how do you think about, say, social movements when you are talking about intergenerational social movements?
Thank you. Thank you very much for responses. And just a quick note, I actually need to leave in 2 minutes because I'm teaching at 4 Belgian time. And I have some few things to set up before I can start teaching. So I'm going to have to leave in 2 minutes. I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you, Stefan, for the response. And I think more people may perhaps have to leave. So I suggest that we end the official part of the workshop here. And if people want to hang around afterwards, they can still do so. But then, yeah, all that's left for me is to say that I really want to thank all of you for participating, and especially the speakers and the respondent for all of these interesting conversations that could have gone on a lot longer, I think. But yeah, there's lots of food for thought. We will post a recording of the lecture online one of these days, I think. And you can stay up to date about further lectures and events of neuroepigenetics by following our website, Facebook, or Twitter. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon then.
Okay, thanks everyone. This was great.
Thank you so much for the invitation and comments, and yeah, it was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, really. Thank you so much. There's a question about elephants in the chat.
It's a question from Yo, so I think those who have time to hang around can listen to it.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. A brave paper and clearly also thought-provoking, but first of all, do you have time? Or because you don't have to have time, obviously.